with, I think, 6 or 7 other astronauts who were on board the Space Shuttle Columbia. With us this evening, presenting about this wonderful Israeli hero, is our guest speaker, Tuvia Book. Tuvia was born in the UK, but when he was just a baby, his parents emigrated to South Africa. And I have that in common with Tuvia, because when I was 10, my parents also emigrated to South Africa, where we spent about 6 years living there. So Tuvia grew up in South Africa for more years than I did. And then when he was 17, he went to, he made Aliyah, and he volunteered for the IDF. Well, before that, he studied in yeshiva, and then he volunteered for the IDF and served in an elite combat unit. Upon his discharge from that unit, he completed a BA at Bar-Ilan University and also certification in graphic design. Tuvia also then served as an information officer at the Israeli consulate in Philadelphia, whilst he also studied towards a graduate degree in Jewish studies. After he did that, after he completed that graduate degree, he then returned to Israel and graduated from a course of study with the Israel Ministry of Tourism. And today, amongst many, many other things, he's a licensed tour guide there. Tuvia has spent much of his adult life working in the field of Jewish education, and has served as an emissary, a shaliach, for the Sochnut, the Jewish agency for Israel. He served as their director of Israel and Zionist education at the Board of Jewish Education of Greater New York. He's been a lecturer and educational guide at the Alexander Muss Institute for Israel Education in Israel for over a decade, and has lectured at both Bar-Ilan University and the Hebrew U. He's authored several books, one of which is entitled For the Sake of Zion, which is a curriculum of Israel studies. And another one is Moral Dilemmas of the Modern Israeli Soldier. So I would recommend you seeking those out and reading them. So it's very clear that we have a very talented and very experienced guide with us tonight. So without further ado, just before I pass you over to Tuvia, all I would ask is that everyone turn off their video, their individual video, and to mute their audio, just so that we can focus on our speaker. And you're free to send any questions, to submit any questions via the chat facility, and we'll sort of remind you periodically throughout the next half an hour to 40 minutes whilst Tuvia presents about Ilan Ramon to submit any questions. So please, as I've just said, please do help us out by turning off your videos and turning off your audio, and sit back and enjoy. So without further ado, I hand you over to Dr. Tuvia Book.
Hello and good evening. Do you have, am I on a co-share, Steve?
Sorry?
Yes. I was just checking I was on a co-share, co-host. I can
Yes.
share the screen
Yes.
soon. Okay, excellent. All right, good evening, everybody. So after that introduction, you won't be surprised to be hearing the Queen's English. I try not to talk with too heavy South African accent so you can understand me. But what I'm going to be talking about tonight is an individual who basically redefines a very common used word. Usually when you use the word hero, we think about, so-and-so is a hero because he scored the last minute of a football game or this or that. The true definition of a hero can be summed up in one word, and that is selflessness, utter, total selflessness. To put everything above yourself. Ilan Ramon was such an individual. Ilan Ramon, Colonel Ilan Ramon, I had the distinct pleasure of meeting a few months before his mission. As Steve mentioned, I was serving as an emissary, as shaliach in New York. And we had a meeting of all the Jewish agency shlichim. It was actually up in Philadelphia. And Ilan Ramon was the guest speaker. And they introduced him. And they gave such an introduction on Colonel Ilan Ramon, Israel's first astronaut, the hero of the Iraqi nuclear reactor operation. And by the time they'd finished the introduction, we expected someone to walk in 6'6" tall with a leather flying jacket and aviation spectacles and cool background music. Instead, this little guy walked in with a huge smile on his face from ear to ear, spoke to us for 20 minutes and didn't once speak in the first person. That's what I remember most about his speech. He always talked about we, and the Jewish people and the Israelis and the enterprise of all of us together. It was just phenomenally humble, and he had a lot to be humble about. And I remember that incredible feeling as all over the world, everybody stopped. Suddenly all the Jews are united, Israelis, Jews around the world, to watch the first time ever an Israeli astronaut go to space. And just to think what he symbolized, literally the son and grandson of Holocaust survivors who were liberated from Auschwitz. And here he is, not wearing a yellow star, but wearing proudly a blue star on his sleeve and going up to touch the stars. The emotion was incredible. And I remember we all rushed to our televisions 2 weeks later after Shabbat to watch the shuttle land, and the shock and the horror when we saw that just 16 minutes before the landing time, the shuttle imploded and exploded. And the shock was felt around the world, not just amongst the Jewish people, of course, but for anyone who understood that the very best of humanity had been aboard that shuttle. Now, with these stories, it helps start logically at the beginning. So I'm going to switch to a slide presentation show right now. And I'm going to talk through the slides so we understand the remarkable journey that Ilan Ramon took in his life. Even though he only lived for 49 years, he managed to accomplish more in those 49 years than most of us could dream of accomplishing, and not in one, but in 2 lifetimes, a life packed with meaning and purpose. So, dramatic pause. Okay. Here we go. Okay, we'll start off with the Israeli Air Force itself. Ilan Ramon started his career off in the Israeli Air Force as a pilot. Now you look at this unusual picture over here, especially because this part of it's very unusual. And everyone knows that Israel has a mandatory draft. You don't have a choice. Unless you're ultra-Orthodox, you can get an exemption based on Torah learning. And most do, even though not everyone does. But most Israelis are drafted at the age of 18. The one unit you can't be drafted to, of course, is the Israeli Air Force pilots course. They have to send you an invitation. And what's an invitation based on? It's based on 3 things. One is your ability academically. The other, of course, is your social ability and your physical ability. And if you qualify, you get this invitation. In Hebrew, it's called Zimun Letais, so an invitation for the pilot's course. Now, just because you get the invitation, it doesn't mean you can go out and buy your aviator glasses and leather jacket. It means you're invited to start the course. It is the most difficult course in the Israeli military. It is a 3-year training course. And when you finish, you also finish with an undergraduate degree in aeronautical engineering as well. And you have to commit to another 10 years of service. So it's massive. And people ask, why is such a long course? One of the reasons, of course, is sheer dollars and cents. The new F-35 Israel just purchased cost each airplane $100 million. Now that is a real chunk of change. The F-16s that Ilan Ramon flew cost $60 million. And that's just the way that Israel was seeing them before they actually went and revamped the entire airplane. So basically you have a situation here where it costs $3 million to train a pilot. Now, in case you think petrol is expensive, $14,000 is the price. In Hebrew, it's called the Shat Tisa, 1 hour's flying time cost. So only the best of the best of the best become pilots. And Ilan Ramon was one of those. Not only was he accepted to the course and finished the course, he was also the cadet of honor. And the reason I'm starting with this particular picture, you'll notice there's a girl in the middle over here, a female. And until about 10 years ago, no females were allowed inside the course. And all that changed when an an immigrant from South Africa called Alice Miller came and said she wanted to be a pilot. And they said, you can't. And then, why not? She said, because you're a woman. And she said, so what? She said, we don't allow women to be pilots. So what did this plucky young immigrant do, who, by the way, already had a civilian pilot's license? She went and took the Air Force High Command to Israel's Supreme Court, took out, well, wouldn't help but to look at Israel's constitution, because Israel does not have a constitution. Instead, she went and brought in the Declaration of Independence and read one sentence. It said, the state of Israel will treat equally every citizen without distinction of gender, race, or religion. And based on that one sentence, they opened up the pilot's course to women on one condition. If you want equality, the condition is you have equality, have the same course as the men. There's not a separate course for men and not a separate course for women. There's not 10 push-ups for men and 5 for women. Equality is equality. So she basically went and she finished and she got into the course, but did she finish it? And the answer is no, because life isn't a Disney film. And instead, she went and got in, but opened the gates for other women. And a couple of years after her, the first woman to finish the course was a famous woman who was the granddaughter of people who'd fought in the Warsaw Ghetto. And so basically, because of this one woman, she changed the entire culture of Israel's Air Force. And Ilan Ramon also is an individual that made a huge difference in life. He started off by finishing the course as the Cadet of Honor. Now, in a remarkable current turn of affairs, a generation later, his son, who we'll talk about briefly, Asaf, also finished as Cadet of Honor. This has only ever happened once in the Israeli Air Force, the Cadet of Honor for the entire Air Force course. Now, what made Ilan Ramon jump to fame? That was something that happened in 1981. I presume you guys can all see this map. And again, you're all welcome to share comments on the chat section. And we will read them afterwards and answer the questions. So if you're looking at this map over here, you notice there's a red line from Eilat to a place called Osirak. Now, today in the Middle East, we have a situation where there's a country starting with I that threatens to destroy Israel if it acquires nuclear potential. That country is called Iran. And one thing we've learned as Jews, if someone says they're going to destroy the Jewish state, believe them. Back in 1981, there was a country next door called Iraq who were this close to building a nuclear reactor. It had been built by our good friends, the French people, and they were literally a few weeks away from becoming operational. Israel's prime minister at the time, Menachem Begin, said to the head of the Air Force Command, when he called him and said, listen, my sister and my parents were killed in the Holocaust, and my watch, there will not be a second Holocaust. Is there any way that we can stop this reactor becoming operational? The head of the Air Force called in his head of operational commanding, a guy called Ilan Ramon, the Ilan Ramon, and said, how can we stop this? Ilan went away to his lonely riders gallery and came back with a crazy plan. And this was his plan, guys. He said, we are going to fly. We can. The only way to stop this reactor going operational is to fly 2,000 kilometers over enemy territory, fuel one on the way there, the way back, with 8 F-16s flying them tip to tip at 400 feet. That's 100 meters, 120 meters above the Earth. So they won't show up on the radar with an F-15 escort. Then we're going to go into the nuclear reactor site and we're going to take it out to specially developed bunker buster bombs. And the last plane in is the most dangerous plane because the element of surprise has been lost. When we turn around to come back, we need to fly 2,000 kilometers back. We can't refuel, or we might just land on the fumes of our petrol, providing we haven't been shot down over the reactor. Now, it sounds like Mission Impossible. And then Ilan Ramon paused and said, I would like to volunteer on the mission, and I would like to be the last pilot in. And everybody was shocked, and they said to him, we don't understand. You just described Mission Impossible. What do you mean you want to be the last pilot in? And he said, I just, one second here. I'm just having a technical glitch over here. Hold on. One second. Okay, I'm back with you guys. Okay, so he said, to Menachem Begin, that my mother and grandmother were the sons of were my mother and grandmother were in Auschwitz and wore yellow star. I now have a blue star and can stop a second Holocaust. I want to be on this mission. Begin agreed. He went on the mission against all the odds. Not only did he succeed, but all the planes got back safely to Israel. Of course, the whole world condemned Israel, and including the United States under Reagan. But 10 years later, in 1991, when the United States invaded Iraq, they were extremely happy that Iraq did not have nuclear potential. And they even wrote a letter of thanks to the state of Israel at the time, General Schwarzkopf. So let's go to the next slide. And we see here how the Israeli F-16s flew wingtip to wingtip just above the earth. It's an incredible, incredible photo here, and an incredible flying to fly 4,000 kilometers, 2,000 kilometers there and back in such an amazing mission. And at the bottom here is Ilan Ramon, the way he looked as a young pilot then on this particular mission. Okay, this here is a photo montage of Ilan Ramon during his Air Force service. So at the bottom right, you see him as a young pilot. Then later on, you see him as he grows older, flying these F-16s. And the picture on the top left is the way that he looked when he was selected to become Israel's first astronaut. Now, when he was selected, he realized that he was representing not just Ilan Ramon, private individual, but he was also representing two other things. He was representing the Jewish state itself, the state of Israel, and also Holocaust survivors and their children. Not only that, but he was also representing the Jewish people. And he was very aware of the symbolic aspect of his mission, to such an extent that even next to his name, as you can see on the mission patch, he insisted they put the Israeli flag next to his name. He also had an Israeli flag on his astronaut uniform on his sleeve. He literally wore it on his sleeve. And when he took his uniform off, he had a shirt with the Israeli flag on it. So here's someone who wore his passion on his sleeve and on his heart. Now, every astronaut is allowed to take something to space with them. And Ilan Ramon decided that he was going to take a number of symbolic objects with him. First of all, he didn't grow up religious at all. He grew up totally secular, and he basically spoke fluent Hebrew. He served in the Israeli military, but like many secular Jews in Israel, he didn't have much religious education. So he went to Houston to start his astronaut training. It took 3 years. He went to the Chabad house in Houston, spoke to the local rabbi there and said, listen, I'm Israeli, but I'm a Hebrew-speaking non-Jew, basically. I don't really know too much about Jewish practices. And it's important to me because I'm going to represent the entire Jewish people to be part of the Jewish traditions, should be part of my mission. He wasn't the first Jewish astronaut, by the way. He was the first Israeli astronaut. He was also the first astronaut that ordered kosher food, even though he himself did not keep kosher. It was that important for him to have kosher food on the mission itself because he was representing the Jewish people. Also, he took a Kiddush cup with him, and we'll talk about that a bit later, and many Jewish significant objects, including a mezuzah, with the outside of it designed by a Holocaust survivor, which had barbed wire on and the letter Shin, show how the Jews had come through everything. But everyone knows that the most incredible item he took with him, I'm going to show you a picture of it right now, is this one. If you look in his hand, this is a day before he was, a day before the end of the mission, he held up in his hand for the whole world to see a teeny Sefer Torah. Now, not just any Torah, this Torah had literally been to the Holocaust. And the story how he came by it and how he came to behold it is an incredible story, a story that's difficult to believe, and yet sometimes the truth is most definitely stranger than fiction. So in this particular case, one of Ilan's missions on the shuttle was to carry out an experiment on something which is very important, which is the issue of global warming. Israel had an experiment called the Midex experiment, and they were going to basically check out how dust storms formed in the Middle East and how that affected global warming. And the University of Tel Aviv was sponsoring the experiment. So Ilan Ramon went to the professor in the University of Tel Aviv, and he said to him, his name was Professor Yosef Yoyachim, he said, listen, as he was talking to him, he looked behind the professor and saw that there was a shelf with a small cupboard which was open and it contained a little Torah scroll. Now, anyone who's been to University of Tel Aviv will know it's not a bastion of Orthodox Judaism, and neither Ilan, Ramon, or the professor were wearing a yidlid, a ritual skull cap. And so, one of these things over here. And so basically, he said, why do you have a Torah in your room? It's most peculiar. The professor answered with a strange accent. He said, actually, originally, I'm from Holland. And in Holland, just before the war where I lived, we had a roundup, and we were all taken to the Westerbork camp, and from there taken to Bergen-Belsen. It was just before my bar mitzvah. And when we got to Bergen-Belsen, there was a rabbi in the camp, which was crazy. And even more crazy, he walked up to me and said, how would you like to read your bar mitzvah portion from a Torah scroll? And Ramon looked at him in shock and said, how can that be? How can there be a Torah scroll in Bergen-Belsen? And the person said, I don't know, but there was. And he told me my Torah portion from this same little scroll. Just as I was supposed to read in the morning of my bar mitzvah, we were all in the barracks, and we put up curtains on the windows so the Germans wouldn't see us. And this little scroll was open on the table, and there was a knock at the door. We were sure being caught. And yet, when the door opened, we saw the camp underground had brought my mother to watch me read my bar mitzvah, the professor recounts. She saw me read my bar mitzvah and turned around and was taken back to her barracks, and I never saw her again. At the end of the ceremony, the rabbi put the Torah into my hand and said, I probably won't survive, but you will. I want you to take this little Torah, and I want you to promise to tell the world what happened here, and to tell the world how our traditions and our Torah are what keeps us Jewish. Please promise. And this 13-year-old boy, he's recounting years later, said, I promise, but never knew how he was going to fulfill that promise to the rabbi. Decades later, in walks Ilan Ramon and says, I need to take this Torah to space. And the professor was incredibly moved. He said, for all my life, I've wondered how to fulfill my promise to this rabbi. And now billions of people are going to see this Torah. They're going to see my Torah from Bergen-Belsen and understand this is what keeps the Jewish people alive, our traditions, our community, our attachment to the land. And with deep emotion, he entrusted the Torah to Ilan Ramon. And Ilan Ramon, of course, held up this Torah, and the whole world did see it. And for a little moment, it floated from his hands, and he grabbed it and pulled it back again and showed it to the world. I'm now going to pause my slide presentation and go to a short 2-minute video clip about this Torah. It's from a documentary called An Article of Hope, and this is just the trailer, and you see the actual footage of Ilan Ramon going up in the shuttle and holding the Torah into space. Dramatic pause. Okay, so it's not loading. I'm going to send the link to Steve later, and he'll send it to you guys who are on this talk. All right, so I wanted to show you this photo over here, talking about symbolism of the Israeli Air Force. This is a picture on the 60th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz, where we see 2 Israeli F-15s flying over Auschwitz-Birkenau. Now, as we know, there was no Allied bombing of Auschwitz-Birkenau during the war, despite pleas to Roosevelt and Churchill. Martin Gilbert even wrote a book called Auschwitz and the Allies, saying that the Allies had these aerial photos and they flew over the camp every day, and they gave many reasons why they couldn't. And 60 years later, Israeli Air Force planes flew over the ruins of Auschwitz and promised to be the shield of Israel. It would never happen again. Ilan Ramon was part of this legacy. Another thing that Ilan Ramon took with him, of course, is this picture. He went to Yad Vashem, and he said, I'd like to take a picture drawn by a child who was killed in the Holocaust with me to space. And he saw this picture by Peter Gintz. Peter Gintz was a Jewish boy born in Prague, incredibly artistically talented. And at the age of 12, he was deported to Theresienstadt ghetto. And for 2 years, he edited the children's newspaper and illustrated it. And there was an incredibly heroic art teacher in Theresienstadt, who, when she was deported to Theresienstadt, had taken one thing with her, and that was a suitcase full of art supplies. And for 2 years, she brought lights to the children, and they sat and they drew. And just before she was deported, the pictures were hidden and found after the war. And Ilan Ramon saw this picture, and he was moved to great emotion, because what this boy, Peter Gibbs, had drawn is the way he sees the world, almost like the John Lennon song, Imagine. Imagine a world with no borders and no countries and no hatred. And here he was, trapped inside this ghetto, imagining being on the moon and looking at the bright globe of the world, where we can focus on peace and love, what we have in common, and not on hatred and death, but rather on life. Ilan Ramon took a copy of this picture also with him to space as well, amongst his symbolic objects. When he was floating above the planet Earth, he crossed over Israel. And when he flew over Israel, it was an incredible moment for him. And this is what he said. I'll read it I'll translate it to English. I'll start in Hebrew and I'll translate it in English. It's an honor and a privilege for me to write this letter from space. Today we flew over Israel. We saw clearly Jerusalem. And when we looked, and at the same time I was looking at our capital, I said a small prayer, Shema Yisrael. We are working for the goodness of all mankind. And from space, the whole world looks like one unit without borders. Therefore, I want to call from above. Let's work together. Let's work for peace. Let's work for a better life for everyone in this world. And that was Ilan Ramon's message. As he stood here with his Israeli flag on his sleeve, his message was, we are all made in God's image. And when we are in space, that becomes much clearer. When we remove far away, because we have to work for the greater good of all humanity. And every single person on the space shuttle with him was the best that humanity had. There was a doctor who was born in India. There was an African-American doctor. There was incredible American astronauts. And every single one represented putting aside what divides us and focusing on what we have in common. It was an incredible mission. The people on it were all incredible. And Ilan Ramon himself was the best that we have to offer. Of course, when the shuttle crashed, no one knew exactly what the cause was. Nobody understood what had happened. What had actually happened, of course, was when the shuttle took off, there were a small piece of foam broke off the booster rocket, knocked out a few heating towers on the left wing. And for 2 weeks, it was flying in space as a death trap. And only when it landed and it went through Earth's atmosphere, the wings superheated and the whole shuttle exploded. But no one knew exactly that $1 billion space shuttle had been brought down by 4 broken heating tiles initially. And so for months afterwards, they were searching the debris to try and understand what had caused it. And as they were searching, trying to piece it together, about 2 months afterwards, a Navajo tracker found this, a scrumpled piece of paper in a field in Texas. And when he looked closely, he saw that there was symbols on it, but they weren't in English, they weren't mathematical numbers. He thought maybe some kind of NASA code. He didn't know what it was. Now don't forget, this piece of paper here, this crumpled mass of paper, had survived an explosion at 20,000 feet, 10,000 degrees centigrade, had lain in a field for 2 months and somehow was still legible, which itself is almost beggars belief. And they sent the scrumpled piece of paper as is to NASA. And clearly there was a Jewish rocket scientist there, because they recognized that the squiggles were actually Hebrew letters. And they figured out it must be something that Ilan Ramon himself wrote. So they started unscrambling it, and they found out it was actually 18 pages of a handwritten diary he'd written in space itself. And they were looking at it, and the Hebrew letters started to come out. And eventually, it was very clear to see that it was handwriting. On the first page of the diary that Ilan Ramon had kept in space, he wrote the following. Some of you might be familiar with the words. This is what he wrote. Yom HaShishi, Vayechulu HaShamayim Va'aretz V'chol Tzva'am. On the 6th day, God created the heavens and the earth and all of the stars. And people were shocked. He'd written the words of the Friday night Kiddush. The big question, of course, is why did Ilan Ramon, on the first day of his diary in space, on the first page, write the words of the Friday night Kiddush? And the answer, of course, is he didn't know it from birth. He didn't know how the words went. So he wrote it down because he said, I'm going to say Kiddush in space. And he spoke to the Baruch, the Chabad rabbi in Houston, and said, how do I say Kiddush in space? And the Chabad rabbi said, well, this is a bit of a problem because when you're in space, every 60 days is Rosh Hashanah, every 14 hours is Shabbat. What do? We have a problem, Jerusalem. But of course, there's the halachot, there's the Jewish laws also for astronauts in space, and they figured it out when he should be saying it, and he said it. Now imagine being in space and surrounded by heavens and earth and stars and saying those words that we used to mumble every Friday night. It was the sixth day and God created the heavens and the earth and all of the stars and seeing them all around you. What a magic moment that must have been. And even more magic is this actually survived, that incredible infiltration, the massive flaming. Of course, the big question is, how were the astronauts identified? And the answer is their dental records. Here we have a picture over here of Ilan Ramon's oldest son, Asaf, with his widow, Rona. And this is when Ilan Ramon's body comes back to Israel. Asaf was 16 years old. And he said, I would like to be like my father. And that's the most incredible thing as a parent, when your child wants to be like you. And Ilan Ramon's son, Asaf, very much wanted to follow his father's footsteps. He wanted to be a pilot. He wanted to be an astronaut. And Ilan Ramon was killed at the tragically young age of 49. He left behind a widow and 4 children. Now, on the one hand, when you sit and go to a shiva house, you don't talk about how somebody died. You talk about how they lived and what they did in their life. And Ilan Ramon managed to pack his life with so much meaning and so much purpose that it was just incredible. But the sad facts are 4 young children were left behind, of which Asaf was the oldest. Now in Israel, if you want to serve in the combat unit in the military and you've already lost a first-degree relative, you need the permission of a parent. And Rona Ramon had to give Asaf permission to become a fighter pilot. And incredibly, as we mentioned before, Asaf Ramon, here he is in his graduation, also was a cadet of honor at his graduation as well. Very much motivated by his father's legacy and his father's life, he himself strove to be the best of the best. Here he is, been given his award by the late Shimon Peres, the president of the state of Israel. And over here is every picture that our mother wants to see. Rona kissing her son, Asaf, at the graduation of the pilot's course. Now, this next page is something that is unbelievable. They say lightning doesn't strike twice. Well, in this case, it did. It says here, "B'chayehem uvumotam," in their lives and in their deaths. And there's a picture of Ilan Ramon and his son Asaf, because unbelievably, on the 14th of September, 2009, Asaf Ramon's F-16 plane disintegrated in a training accident, and he was killed. Here's his family who's already paid the ultimate price of Ilan himself dying in honor of the state of Israel and his tragedy. And then just a few years later, Rona herself loses not only her husband, her oldest son as well. It's unbelievable. The Israeli newspapers the next day were full of this. People were in total shock. It says on the right here, Goral Echad, one fate for everyone. And Kamo Abba, he was like his dad in every way. There are people who strove for the best of what's good for the Jewish people of the state of Israel, and both ended their life tragically early. And that's not even the end of the Ramon tragic story, because just a year after Israel's latest airport in Eilat, the Ilan and Asaf Ramon airport was opened by Rona Ramon herself. She herself succumbed to cancer at the tragically young age of 54, leaving 3 children behind. Now, the last day that Ilan Ramon was able to send a message to his family, he sent them a song. And the song was a song written by Rachel the poetess, an incredibly well-known song in Israel called Zemen Noga. And in it, prophetically, this is the song he sent to his wife the day before his last day on earth. Of course, nobody knows how long they're going to live for. We should live every day like it's our last, but we always assume we have a whole life ahead of us. And this is what he said to his wife. "Atishma koli v'choki sheli." Listen to my voice, my distant one. Listen to my voice wherever you are. It's a voice that cries in strength, a voice that cries with tears, and everything else that commands you a prayer. I'm going to switch now to the English version of it. And this is the last email that he wrote to his wife, and this is what's written inside it. "We meet for a moment and separate forever. My final days are very close. Near is the day of goodbye tears. I will wait for you until my life will end, like Rachel waited for her beloved." And of course, he didn't know that was going to be his last day. He didn't know when he held up the Torah, that was going to be the last day that Torah was seen. And the Torah itself also vanished, just like Ilan, Ramon, and the astronauts on the space shuttle itself. And really, that had been the purpose of the Torah. For decades, this Torah sat in the professor's study, waiting for the world to see it. And Ilan Ramon took up this Torah, and he showed the world that against all of the odds, what had allowed the Jewish people to survive were three things. One is our sense of tradition, our shared tradition, our Torah, the Torah itself, that we took with us everywhere we went, in good times to bad times. From Australia to Afghanistan, we had our Torah, we had our traditions. The second thing he taught us all is our community, Torah Yisrael, Am Yisrael, the nation of Israel, the people of Israel. Just like in medieval times, you could go to a synagogue in any city in the world, you'd be welcomed in, and if you got into trouble, you'd be redeemed by the local community. Even today, we have this thread that connects all of Jewish communities together wherever we live. We're all brothers and sisters. Am Yisrael, Torah Yisrael. But the mortar that holds those two bricks together was what Ilan Ramon himself represented. That, of course, is the land of Israel itself, Eretz Yisrael, Medinat Yisrael. Ilan Ramon represented all three of these things, with his Israeli flags, with his background as the son and grandson of Holocaust survivors, with his achievements as a pilot, as an astronaut. He wanted us all to know that his mission was deeply symbolic. It wasn't just a man going to space. It wasn't just Ilan Ramon going to space. Rather, it was an Israeli Jew, like a phoenix from the ashes. The state of Israel itself rose after the Holocaust, and so did Ilan Ramon go up into space and vanish in a blaze of glory. Now again, no one knows how long they've got to live. We could live a long, meaningless life. We could live a short life packed in meaning. What Ilan Ramon taught us is make sure that every single day counts. Pack every life with purpose and meaning. And most importantly, not just for yourself. Our role of Jews in this world is to make sure that we leave a better world behind us. Just as Ilan Ramon's experiment was about global warming, so we should also strive to make a better world. But the things that do remain behind after us, what is our eternity itself? Ilan Ramon taught us this lesson as well, are three things: our children, Ilan Ramon's children in this case, or our own children, our Yiladim, our Maasim Tovim, our good deeds, and of course, what we create to make this world better. And Ilan Ramon, in his 49 years, taught us all this incredible lesson that we should always strive for the betterment of our people, our state, our religion, and the planet that we live in. Ladies and gentlemen, I want to thank you for joining us. I want to thank the Zionist Federation for sponsoring this talk, and I'd welcome for any questions. Over to you guys.
Okay, thank you, Tuvia. That was a very heartwarming, very bittersweet recollection of a, like you say, a very selfless and amazing Israeli man, a hero. You mentioned and you showed an image of Asaf, his eldest son, and his widow Rona, standing by what looked like a coffin, but then you also mentioned, if I'm not mistaken, that nothing was found from the wreckage. So are we to assume that his body was never recovered? You mentioned that Torah was never found.
Well, what they did found, which allowed positive identifications, they found jawbones, and they could tell by the dental records who they belonged to. So that's why in Israel, normally when you die, you're buried right into the ground with a talit. The only exception, of course, are IDF soldiers who are buried in coffins with the Israeli flag on them, because unfortunately, sometimes the body itself isn't whole. And in this case with Ilan Ramon, there was a positive identification of part of his body, which was what's inside this coffin draped with the Israeli flag that was sent back to the United States. By the way, he's buried in a Halal cemetery in the Moshav where Moshe Dayan grew up, which is also next to his Air Force base in Ramat David, and his son is buried in the grave next to him.
Wow. Okay. Okay. Thank you. And we have a question here from Sam Sagar, who's in the audience.
Okay.
Sorry, no, not from Sam Sagar. Sorry, from Bernard Glass, who's asked how was Ilan chosen for the mission? Did he volunteer? Perhaps you could explain a little bit about that.
Okay, well, it was just when President Clinton spoke to Shimon Peres, he said, listen, our countries are really striving towards peaceful cooperation together, and we have an opening as a payload specialist in a shuttle mission coming up in 2 years' time. Would you like to select someone? So Shimon Peres spoke to the head of the Israeli Air Force and said, do you have anyone in mind? And every single person in the Air Force said the same name. They all said Ilan Ramon. It was just a consensus, unanimous consensus where people basically, there was no other candidate. He'd already shown his bravery, he'd shown his patriotism, and most importantly, he'd shown his utter and total love of the state of Israel and the Jewish people, and his technical competence as well. In fact, he was so incredibly technically competent that he was upgraded from payload specialist to mission specialist during his training.
That's quite an upgrade. We have another question here, quite a general question about Ilan from Corinne Ben. Do we know much about his childhood? You spoke of his secular nature. That's presumably because his parents raised him as such. Does that perhaps, his secular nature, does that have anything to do with his mother having come through the Holocaust and perhaps having lost some faith?
It's a very good question. At the end of the day, his father, by the way, Ilan Ramon's name was changed when he went to the Air Force. His birth name was Wolfowitz, actually. His father hadn't been to the Holocaust. His father was a Sabra who actually fought Israel's War of Independence. So you had two very different kinds of parents. On the one hand, the mother and grandmother who'd been from Auschwitz to Israel, and the father who was the labor Zionist Sabra who fought in all of the wars. We always had that question about nature and nurture. In this case, Ilan Ramon was raised in the suburb of Omer, which is the suburb of Beersheba, where there's a lot of intellectuals, a lot of academics, a lot of people who work in Sorka Hospital. The doctors live in this particular suburb. And he was given an incredible top-class secular education. As far as faith after the Holocaust, it's a difficult question to answer, and to understand as well. My late grandfather lost his entire family in the Shoah. And when he came to England, he was a Hasidic Jew, shaved off his beard and his peyot, but still remains traditional. Some people, it strengthens them, some people, it weakened them. In Ilan Ramon's case, he grew up as a proud, patriotic Zionist Israeli, but religion was very much not part of his upbringing. And that's why he did a fast catch-up course when he went to Houston, realizing he was representing not just Israelis, but also the Jewish people globally.
We have another question here. Now, I know that, sorry, whoever has their audio on, please switch it off as we're hearing quite a bit of feedback via that. Thank you. So we have another question here from Bernard Glass. Look, we're all aware that Ilan Ramon was Israel's first astronaut, and thus far he's been their only astronaut. But Bernard Glass asks, is it true that there have been many Jewish astronauts? So not necessarily Israeli, obviously, but Jewish astronauts.
There have been some Jewish ones, but none of them were overtly Jewish. None of them had asked for kosher food before, and none of them, and in a tremendous parallel, tragic parallel, the only other shuttle disaster, of course, was the Challenger back in 1986 that exploded on takeoff. And the teacher, the civilian teacher, Judith Resnick, who was on that shuttle flight, was also Jewish as well. And there had been two other American Jewish astronauts, but again, none of them were practicing observing, and none of them took any symbolic articles to space with them. They were basically born Jewish, but weren't practicing Jews.
Okay, thanks. And then we have another question here, which, look, you know, is perhaps not something that you can answer with great certainty. But Mark Newman has asked, when do you think we'll see the first Israeli astronaut to land on the moon and to land on Mars?
Well, Mark Newman's guess is as good as mine. We almost landed a spaceship on the moon. It actually did land, but like in typical Israeli fashion, it crash landed last year. But it was incredible we even got it to the moon itself. Yeah. And the glitch was caused by the British-made engine, but we'll talk no more about that.
And just on that subject then, Tuvia, are there, I'm sure I've read over the past year that there have been plans to sort of, you know, attempt that again, to land a craft on the moon.
Yes, absolutely. The same guy who sponsored the first mission, he's already put in the funds for a second attempt as well. I mean, they were so close. It was almost painful. We were missing about 4 feet.
You spoke about Asaf, who very obviously, you know, followed in his father's footsteps, wanted to be like his Abba, and you know, we're aware that there's 3 other children who survived them. Just a very brief question: have any of them followed in Ilan's footsteps? Do you know?
No. Well, that's very interesting. After Asaf was killed, the press somehow got the news before his mother, which is just incredible. They were waiting outside the house when she came home and asked her what her thoughts were. And she hadn't actually officially been informed by the Air Force that her son had been killed. So after this tragedy, this heartless tragedy, there was a pact in Israel to give utter and total privacy to the remaining 3 children. And that has been honored. And to that is the reason I or anyone in Israel knows nothing about the other 3 children, because they've been given the privacy that they deserve.
Absolutely, no, as they should. And I know the answer, and I suspect lots of, you know, other people in the audience may know, but for those who might not know, are there any monuments to Ilan Ramon in Israel?
Okay, well, the best monuments are the living monuments. Rana Mamon, in her short life before she passed, founded the Ilan and Asaf Ramon Foundation, which encourages children from both Muslim, Christian, and Jewish Israeli children to scientific experiments and discovery, and basically gives scholarships to any Israeli citizens, irrespective of their gender or religion, who wants to pursue a career in science and hopefully become Israel's second astronaut. So you have the Ilan and Asaf Ramon Foundation. You also have in Mitzpeh Ramon itself, the visitor center was closed for many years and reopened a couple of years ago with a tremendously moving exhibit on Ilan and Asaf Ramon, including a film which actually has footage of the last conversation that he had with his family before the shuttle exploded from space itself. So that is well worth a visit next time you're in Israel, the Mitzpeh Ramon Visitor Center. And finally, as I mentioned before, Israel's latest airport, just north of Eilat. They closed down the old airport in Eilat, built a new airport a few kilometers further to the north, state-of-the-art airport, which also with the peace with Jordan, with one day we hope Jordanian and Israeli planes will both be using this airport. It's a situation right on the border in the Arava, and that is called the official name, Ilan and Asaf Ramon Airport. And anyone who lands in Ben Gurion Airport will notice the whole arrivals terminal is actually named the Ilan Ramon terminal as well.
Yeah, absolutely. How amazing.
But of course, most importantly, just to finish off, is the name itself. You know, the name of Ilan Ramon and his legacy. You know, we learn as Jews, it doesn't matter how long you live, it matters what you do with the life that you live. And Ilan Ramon's name is still spoken with awe and reverence throughout Israeli society.
For sure. So just a couple of more questions for you. In terms of the nuclear reactor, in terms of Ilan's place in helping to destroy the nuclear reactor in Iraq, someone here, Edward Phelan, asks, do you think it can be positive, for example, that Ilan Ramon helped prevent not only a war in the Middle East, but perhaps even a world war?
It's a very interesting question, and the answer I could say was probably yes, because we all know that 10 years after the operation itself, America launched Operation Desert Storm, and people always think that the next major war will break out somewhere in the Middle East. And if Saddam Hussein would have had nuclear capacity back in 1991 and the Israeli mission had failed, then the chances are those nuclear weapons might have been used against the United States. So this is all one of those what ifs. We will never know, of course. And they might have responded in kind, and the Soviets might have been pulled in, and who knows what could have happened. But none of it happened because it was basically stopped before it become operational. And also, if we talk about the what ifs, it would have become operational. That would have presented a clear and present danger to the state of Israel. And to this day, if any country, including Iran, tries to get the potential to destroy the Jewish state, the reason we need to stop them is for something called the Begin Doctrine. And Menachem Begin said, there will never again means never again, as long as there is a Jewish state.
Yeah. Okay, well, thank you, Tuvia. It's, you know, I'm seeing a few remarks in the chat that, you know, thanking you for an excellent presentation. It's certainly been a very engaging one, a very inspiring one, despite the, you know, the tragedy of Ilan's life being brought to such a tragic end, and obviously then his eldest son and his wife. But it's nonetheless a very inspirational story. So thank you for joining us. Thank you everyone for joining us this evening. We hope you all enjoyed it, and that you've each managed to take something, you know, to have learned something in this, and taken that away with you. So thank you very much. Be sure to look out for our newsletter and on our social media for future webinars. And I think that all that remains is to just say thank you to everyone. And again, thank you to Tuvia. Thank you very much, everyone.
Yes,
Good night.
I'd like to thank my sponsors and wish everyone a Shana Tova.
Yes, Shana Tova, everyone. Thank you. Bye-bye.